Hello, welcome to the Chapter 16 problem solving session. Let's get started. First thing we're going to look at is applying factory overhead. So we've got a situation where we need to first find the factory overhead rate, and then we'll apply the overhead to two jobs and prepare the journal entry. So let's see. The basic formula for determining the predetermined factory overhead is going to be the estimated overhead, right? So let me see if I can highlight that. We've got the estimated factory overhead, right? They estimate that factory overhead will cost $620,000 for the year, and they estimate the direct labor hours are going to be 80,000. So we're going to find a rate, and the rate is using direct labor hours as the activity base. And then we're going to apply that overhead to two jobs, job number 200 and job number 305. So let's find our rate, put those two pieces together. So when we do that, let me see if I can get that. So in A, we're going to take the estimated factory overhead over the estimated direct labor hours. So the estimated factory overhead over the estimated direct labor hours, right? So the estimated factory overhead over the estimated direct labor hours, right? $620,000 of overhead over 80,000 direct labor hours gives us our rate, right? Our rate is $7.75 per direct labor hour. So every time we can trace a direct labor hour to a job, we're going to assign $7.75 of overhead for each direct labor hour. And we've got two jobs, job number 200 and job number 305. Now, the data for jobs 200 and 305 is in the previous exercise 16.2. I'm not going to go back to 16.2 and get it. I'm just going to show you that information, and you can get that on your own. But for those two jobs, let's see. Let's start with job number 200. So for job number 200 here in part B, we have 2,500 hours. Let me just here. There we go. We have 2,500 hours. And each hour is going to be assigned $7.75 of overhead. $7.75 of overhead. So we've got $19,375 worth of overhead, right? 2,500 hours. So the way we get the rate is always going to be the estimated overhead over the estimated hours. So $7.75 per hour. And then the way we apply overhead is always going to be the actual activity base, right? So in this case, we have the actual hours. Let me go ahead and put that in here so we have that as kind of a point of reference, right? We're always going to apply the overhead as the actual activity base, right? Actual activity times the rate. Who's the allocated overhead? That's what we've done, right? We've taken the actual activity, 2,500 direct labor hours, and we've multiplied times the $7.75. So this is, right, 2,500 direct labor hours. And I always like to abbreviate those direct labor hours, DLH, direct labor hours, 2,500 direct labor hours times $7.75. And we would do the same thing for job number 305, right? For job number 305, what we're going to do is we're going to take the actual hours that we can trace to that job, right? We can trace 3,000 hours to that job, and something happened here. Let me just see if I can go ahead and fix that. Yeah, there we go. So here we've got, for job number 305, we've got 3,000 direct labor hours, right? 3,000 direct labor hours. I want to take those 3,000 direct labor hours and we want to allocate that overhead based on $7.75 for each hour that we can trace to that job. So we're always going to apply overhead in this way, right? It's always going to be the actual activity, whatever that activity base is. You want to take that actual activity base and you want to multiply times that rate, that predetermined overhead rate, and you'll get the allocated overhead. So that's the amount of overhead that we've allocated to these two jobs. Okay. And if we want to just put in a total here, let me go ahead and do that. Let me put in a total. So the kind of the total overhead, the sum of the two is 42,625. 42,625. That's the total overhead for these two jobs that we've just allocated using this predetermined rate of $7.75. Now, what do we have to do next? So we've done A and we've done B. So let me just make a note here that this is B. Now we got C. Now we need a journal entry to apply that factory overhead to both jobs in May according to the predetermined overhead rate. Well, the way we apply the overhead, and let me just give you that journal entry real quick. All we're going to do is put the overhead in the work in process account. The allocated overhead goes in the work in process account. And the offsetting credit to that entry is going to be the factory overhead account. So in this case, we're going to put the allocated overhead in work in process, debit work in process for 42,625, and credit factory overhead for 42,625. That's why I put in that total. So we'd have the total amount that we needed for part C. Okay, so we found the rate, we applied the overhead, and then what we also did was we prepared the journal entry to record that overhead for both jobs in the work in process account. Okay, next one. Now we need the entries for the direct labor and the factory overhead. So let's see, we're going to journalize the entry to record the factory labor cost. So we need to record that factory labor first. And they give us the information that we need, but it's not given to us in the format that we need it. So we got to do a little bit of manipulation here. So what we're told, and let me see if I can highlight this here. We're told that the overhead is applied to the jobs on the basis of a rate, a predetermined overhead rate of $23. So that's our rate. The rate is $23 per direct labor hour. So we're going to need that to allocate the overhead. And then the cost of the direct labor is $29. So let me emphasize the difference between those two numbers. $23 is the overhead rate, right? For every direct labor hour, we're going to assign $23 of overhead. The actual direct labor rate that the employees are paid is the $29. And it's the $29, right, that we're going to use to determine the actual cost of that labor. That's where these numbers came from, right? They determined that the cost of the labor was however many hours that were worked times $29, right? That's how we got the cost of labor. And the cost of all this labor, right? So we have all these jobs. We have 5 jobs, right? So if we look at these 5 jobs, right, the cost of all this labor, right, is 47,792. That's what all the labor cost, right? So they have all these jobs that they worked on, and the amount of labor, right? The time tickets from June for these jobs, right, showed that the labor is 47,792 for job number 101, 102, 103, 104, 105. That's what the labor costs. The labor cost that they can trace to the job. So this is direct labor. Okay. So this is what we call direct labor. And I'm going to abbreviate that a little bit just to make it a little bit easier to write it out. That's the direct labor. Okay. And this is the overhead, right? Factory supervision, that's overhead, right? I'm going to abbreviate that too. That's overhead, right? That's the cost of the labor that's in the overhead. And what we need to be able to do is journalize the entry to record the factory overhead costs. That's what we need to be able to do. So essentially what we're being asked to do is prepare a journal entry for this, right? Record the labor that is direct, record the labor that is overhead. That's all we're going to do. So one entry to do that, and I have that entry. Let me give that to you. So we're going to record that labor, two components of labor, right? So right here, there we go. So the labor that is direct is the 47,792. That's what goes to the work in process account. The labor that is the overhead piece, right? The factory overhead, and this, for some reason, the formatting is off just a little bit. So let me just fix that. There we go. Okay. So the labor that is the overhead, well, the overhead goes to the overhead account, right? The 12,500. But all of the labor is a total of 60,292. So all this labor, right? We add all this up. This is the 60,292. That's the total, right? So the total labor here, right? So the total labor is the 60,292. That's what the entry's for, right? So we just recorded the total labor goes into wages payable. That's the total amount that they owe, the 60,292. And there are two pieces. One piece is the direct labor that goes to work in process. The other piece is the overhead that goes to overhead. And now we have to apply that factory overhead. We've got to allocate the overhead to the work in process account because we can't trace it, right? We can't trace overhead to work in process. It's indirect. So let's go to this work in process account and make sure we assign or allocate that overhead based on this rate. So the allocation of overhead should be based on the hours, right? The actual hours that we can trace to these jobs times that rate. How many hours can we trace? Well, see that's a part of the manipulation that we're going to need to do. They didn't actually give us the hours. They just gave us the direct labor. But the thing is, what we know here is that this labor is based on $29 an hour, right? It's based on $29 an hour. So all the labor, all the direct labor costs 47,792, and they paid these people $29 an hour. That's 1,648 hours. So that's the little bit of manipulation that we need. That's the direct labor hours. So we just take the total cost of labor, divide by $29, and they worked 1,648 hours. That's great because now we know how much overhead we're going to apply. We're going to apply that overhead based on 1,648 hours. That's how we apply the overhead, right? We're going to take the actual hours that we can trace to our jobs and multiply times our rate, $23. That's the amount of overhead that we need to assign to these jobs, the amount of overhead that we're going to apply or allocate to work in process. So our basic entry is going to be to record that overhead in that work in process account. Debit work in process for 37,904, credit factory overhead for 37,904. So again, first we put all that labor in the work in process account that is direct. We put the overhead in the overhead account, record the total liability. Then we apply that overhead to the work in process based on the hours that we computed. Total cost of labor divided by $29 an hour gives us total hours. Multiply the hours times the rate, and we've assigned or allocated that overhead. And that's what we need for exercise 16-8. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Now, we're going to add a little bit of complexity here. The complexity here is that we have two factories. And for these two factories, we need to apply the overhead to the jobs. For factory one, we're going to apply the overhead based on direct labor hours. So factory one is based on direct labor hours. And then factory two is going to be based on machine hours. So factory one is based on, no, I'm sorry, factory one is based on machine hours. Factory one is based on machine hours. Factory two is based on direct labor hours. So factory one is based on machine hours, right? So it's the overhead allocated based on machine hours. Factory two is based on labor hours. Factory two is based on labor hours, right? So remember, the way we calculate an overhead rate is going to be the estimated overhead divided by the estimated base. So the estimated overhead divided by the estimated base, right? The estimated overhead divided by the estimated base. That's all we're going to do to get our overhead rates, right? So we need to find a rate for factory one and a rate for factory two. So we've got the information we need. We're given the data. All we have to do is do the math and calculate those rates, right? So let's see. We're going to need here for factory one, we're going to need the 18.5 divided by the 1,250,000, which will be 1480. And let me get both of these in here and then I'll do what I need to do to clean them up a little bit. And here's two. So let's see, where's my pencil here? So the 18.5 divided by 1,250,000, the 44 divided by 800. We have a rate of 1480 per machine hour, a rate of 55 per direct labor hour. That's what we've got here, right? So we got 1480 here, right? And 55 here. So again, 1480 is what we got here. And 55 is what we've got here. So 1480 per machine hour, 55 per direct labor hour. Those are the rates. And then we need to be able to journalize the entry to apply that overhead in each factory in the month of August. We got to apply that overhead for each factory in the month of August. So let's see. I think I'll try to do C down here. I think it might be easier to do C down here. So let's see. Let's if I can do C here and C, we're going to do factory one first. I'm just going to abbreviate that as F1. F1 is factory one. So for factory one, we need to apply the overhead, right? And how are we going to apply that overhead? For factory one, we need to apply the overhead based on the actual machine hours times the rate. I think it might be easier for me to type that in. So we're going to need the actual machine hours, right? Actual machine hours times the rate. And that'll give us the allocated overhead. And for factory two, right, we're going to be looking, I'll put that down here as well. We're going to be looking at the actual direct labor hours times the rate equals the allocated overhead. So let's see, let's do factory one. So we're going to need the actual machine hours, and let me go up here and highlight those, right? Actual machine hours, 105,000. So we got, well, 105,000 machine hours, and we want to multiply 105,000 machine hours, right? 105,000 machine hours times 1480. Over factory two, it's going to be 64,500 direct labor hours times $55. So let's do factory one first. So this is F2. So for factory one, here we go. 105,000 machine hours, 1480, 1,554,000 is the amount of overhead we allocate to factory one. For factory two, though, $64,500 direct labor hours times $55, right? So we got to make sure that what we're using here is the direct labor hours that we can trace. Here, we're using the machine hours that we can trace. And let me fix that. There we go. So we have assigned or allocated the overhead in Part C to factory one and to factory two. And now that we've done that, right? So the first thing we did, let's summarize where we're at. We completed the rates in factory one, estimated overhead over the estimated activity base. Same thing for factory two, estimated overhead over the estimated activity base. Then we use those rates to assign the overhead. And now that we've assigned the overhead, we need to actually prepare the journal entry for factory overhead in each factory. Journalize that factory overhead in each factory. So let me see where I can put that at. I can probably put that over here on the side. So let's do that. So in factory one, we have 1,000,054. That over just a little bit here. There we go. Close enough. So we assigned allocated overhead of 1,554 to work in process. Debit work in process, credit factory overhead. Same thing for factory two. We're going to make sure that we assign that overhead that we just calculated to work in process. Right? So we debit work in process for the factory overhead we allocated, credit factory overhead. So find the rate, determine the amount of overhead that should be allocated, and then if we need an entry, just put it in work in process, right? The allocated overhead goes to work in process. The actual overhead just goes direct to factory overhead. We would just debit it to factory overhead. And now we need to determine whether or not we're over or under applied. Are we over or under applied? Over or under applied. So what we need to consider here, so let's see, let's look at factory one first. Factory one, right? For factory one, we need to look at the actual overhead versus the applied overhead. That's what we need. We need actual overhead versus the applied overhead. And let me see if I can get all of that here. There we go. Okay. So actual overhead, where's that at? That's up here. Actual overhead, 1,551,558, right? The actual overhead is 1,551,558. And then we just applied 1,554. So the actual overhead of 1,551,558 versus the applied overhead of 1,554. We haven't applied enough, or we've over applied. We've over applied. 1,554 is greater than the actual. We have over applied our overhead by how much? 38,200. Take the difference between the two. So we have applied too much overhead, right? Too much overhead has been applied, right? We've applied $38,200 more than we should have, right? More than the actual overhead. What about for factory two? Well, for factory two, now we want to, again, consider the actual overhead and the applied overhead. So what's the actual overhead for factory two? Well, for factory two, the actual overhead is 3,606,300. So actual overhead is 3,606,300. The applied overhead is only 3,547,000. So now what we've got is we have not applied enough. We have not applied enough, right? So when we look at this overhead now for factory 2. We have an actual that is over 3.6 million, but we've only applied 3,547,500. We haven't applied enough. We are under applied. This is a good representative problem, right? Find the rates, right? Two different rates, two factories, find the rates, and then apply the overhead and assign that overhead to the work in process with a journal entry. And then determine whether or not we're over or under applied. Are we over or under applied? Okay. Next, I think this might be the last one that I assigned in this chapter. Yes, it is. So now in 1611, we have a more practical example. What we need to be able to do in this case, this is not a manufacturing-based operation, but instead, what this is it's a hospital, and we have an operating room. And what we need to be able to do is determine what the rate should be, the predetermined operating room overhead rate, and then apply the overhead to a procedure, and then determine if we're under or over applied for the operating room. So let's go ahead and find the rate. So again, the way we find a rate is we want to take the estimated overhead over the estimated activity base. So what's the overhead? Oh, it's right here. It's $812,000. That's the amount of overhead that we're going to be using. And we need an allocation base. Well, the allocation base or the activity base is the number of surgical room hours, right? So we've got the estimated overhead over the estimated surgical room hours. The estimated surgical room hours. So let's see, they don't give that to us, but they kind of tell us the information that we need. They tell us that the operating room is used 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's shut down for 2 weeks a year. Well, that's enough information to go with. So let me see if I can, it might be easier to type the calculation that we need here. We need to figure out how many hours that's going to be, because the way we find the rate is by taking the estimated overhead of 812 and dividing it by, in this case, the number of hours that we get. So let's see. The way I would do this in part A, right? We have hours per day, right? The hours per day are 8. And then we have the days per week, 7 days a week. We want to multiply by the 7 days per week. And that will give us the total hours per week, which in this case is going to be 56. That's 56 hours. That's 56 hours per week. And now, well, the weeks per year. How many weeks in a year? Well, there are 52 weeks in a year, but this specifically says here that they shut down for 2 weeks. So the operating room is not going to be open those 2 weeks. So we're only going to have 50 weeks in a year. So we want to multiply by the 50 weeks. It might be easier if I was 50. So the estimated operating room hours is going to be 2,800, right? That's what all this works out to. So let me see if I can try and, right, so that's 56. We want to multiply times 50. And let me put in pencil here. So 8 times 7 gives us 56, right? 56 hours per week. And then we got 50 weeks in a year. That's going to give us the 2,800 hours for the year. That's what we need. So now remember, the way we get a rate is we take the estimated overhead over the estimated activity base, right? So right here, the estimated overhead, right? The estimated overhead over the estimated base. Right. So we've got the estimated overhead of 812,000 over the estimated operating room hours, 2,800, gives us $290 per operating room hour. That's our rate. Our rate is $290 per operating room hour. So we've got our rate. We had to do a little work to get that rate because they didn't give us the total hours that we would need in that denominator. They just told us what the denominator should be, but didn't give us the denominator. And now we have Ebony Jones, who has a 5-hour procedure on January 22nd. How much overhead are we going to charge? Well, the way we assign overhead is by taking the actual hours times the rate. Actual hours times the rate. So in B, right? In B, we have 5 hours times $290, right? $209 per hour. We got 5-hour procedure times $290. That's the amount of overhead that we assign for this 5-hour procedure that Ebony Jones has. And now in C, is the overhead over or under applied for the period? Well, in C, if we want to know if the overhead is under or over applied, well, we need to consider the actual overhead and the applied overhead. Actual overhead and the applied overhead. Well, the actual overhead's given. It's right there, 67,250. So the actual overhead is 67,250. And we need to compare that to the applied overhead. Actual overhead compared to the applied overhead. So we need applied overhead. What's the applied overhead? How do we get that? Well, let's see. The applied overhead. The applied overhead should be the number of hours, right? 240 hours times the rate, $290. So $240 times $290 is 69.6. 69.6. That is the applied overhead, right? So the applied overhead of 69.6. 69.6, which means that we've applied too much, right? We are over applied. We are over applied. Over applied by $2,350. We are over applied by $2,350. We've applied too much, right? The actual is 67,250, that's given. And we applied based on 240 actual hours used, right? Times $290. We applied 69.6. We applied too much. We are over applied. And that's it. That's it for chapter 16. I'll see you in the next chapter, chapter 18. Take care.